Welcome to MACo's Conduit Street Podcast. I'm Sharon Green Middleton, Vice President of the Baltimore City Council. You've come to the right place for insightful views on policy and politics that shape the future of Maryland local government.
Hello, and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. You have some guest co-hosts with you today, stepping in for our fearless leaders. This is Sarah Sample from the MACo Policy Team, and it is officially 3-ish days after session. So today we have what will be a bit of a rapid round on a handful of bills and issues between my portfolio and my colleague Dominic Butchko. Welcome, Dominic.
Hey, Sarah. I am thrilled to be on the other end. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. I mean, like the 90 days, it's 90 days, but it feels like it's a year and it goes slow and fast. But like the mental and like emotional and physical toll it takes is really hard to even like describe for someone who hasn't done it.
Well, it's like a reverse school year. Like in school, you go for 9 months and you don't see your friends over the summer, and then it's like starting from scratch to see them. Oh my God, I haven't seen you in forever. It's the exact same, but flipped. So there's people where you have not seen them for most of the year, and then you're just right back in the trenches, either on the same side or opposite side, doing it all over again.
Yeah. And it's like re-entering the world. Like that's like big stuff with like family and friends and stuff too. You've got to like find a way to like reintegrate yourself. But like for me, the first day, like Tuesday, I just like walked around my yard looking at plants. Like my neighbors were looking at me like, what is that lady doing? But,
so is that what you're doing to reintegrate? You're just staring at plants and neighbors?
Staring at plants, yeah, waiting for my seedlings to emerge. But I mean, we're still working obviously a little bit, just wrapping up some loose ends. But next week I'm going to be out of here. I'm actually going to take some time off. But yeah, Tuesday was sort of like coming out of the fog in a way. What about you?
I've decided to deep clean my house. And so like every room, like getting into those nooks and crannies, just like a session is over. It's a new season. And so like really getting into that new vibes. And much like you, I'm going to Charleston this coming week. So get out of town for a little bit, reset, and then start planning for summer conference right around the corner.
Nice. Well, what do we want to go ahead and share with the audience members? Some things that were top of our minds and top of our list for our policy areas?
Yeah, why don't you go first? Tell me about education. I hear some stuff happened.
Ooh, that's a big deep breath. All right, so education, this is my first session doing it. Lots of stakeholders, lots of priorities, lots of money associated with it. So there were a few bills that were sort of blueprint alteration bills. And so I would say there were 4 primary vehicles for sort of significant fiscal or operational changes to the blueprint. Now, as we're sort of embarking on year 4, I think it is, of implementation. The other bills were tweaking things here and there, but they didn't really rise to the level of impact that there were these 4 major vehicles did for us. But so the one that was really the last one standing was the governor's bill. So that was House Bill 504, Senate Bill 429. There was a good bit of back and forth leading to some middle ground between, I think, the governor's office, the House, and the Senate. And that's sort of like from the county perspective, we're really focused on sort of that funding component. So as the governor had initially introduced it from a funding standpoint, they were rolling back something called collaborative time and the funding for that. And so they were going to pause the funding and the implementation of it for 4 years. And then they were also going to flat fund the community schools for 2 years. And then I think there was the third major financial component was holding harmless special education. And so it did a bunch of other things like reinvesting in teacher recruitment, retention, some professional development stuff. But that's sort of how it initially came in from the governor's office.
Awesome. So what ended up happening? Did these bills kind of fight to the death, or what was the final outcome?
Not to the death. I mean, I think they got to a pretty good middle ground. I think that middle ground actually did seem a little bit obvious as the conversation was developing. But so where they just jumping to the end, where they landed was a 3-year pause on the policy of implementing collaborative time. So you don't have to implement collaborative time until, and this is the local education agencies, you don't have to implement it until FY 29. So like the state and locals will still be funding the original amount for FY 26 because the schools and the counties are currently in their budget planning process, and the General Assembly was conscious of not trying to disrupt that this year. So that means that nothing changes for the local funding requirement now for FY 26, and that's whether you're providing what's called sort of the adjusted local share or maintenance of effort. But then for FY 27 and FY 28, there will be a funding pause. So at that point, you've got the policy pause continuing and a funding pause that starts. So the state portion of funding for collaborative time will not flow through to the schools. And again, they don't have to implement. And so this means there will also be a modest reduction in costs for any jurisdictions. That is currently paying the adjusted local share of school funding in those years, which is only about 10 jurisdictions. And the savings will be about, I think, 1% of the total county share in those years. And then in FY 29, it's going to pick back up, but it picks back up at what the FY 27 funding amount was, which is, I think it's like $334 per pupil.
Okay.
So yeah, a lot to unpack when it came to the finance stuff, but I think they got to a pretty good place. Like I said, only 10 jurisdictions will really see those savings because the majority are paying something called maintenance of effort, which means you're going above and beyond your local share of contribution. So that local component doesn't get affected as much. But yeah,
Well,
that's
honestly, Sarah, though, I mean, in a session like this, when every single penny counts, this is your first year with education, and you're already getting our members some major victories on the funding side. So hats off to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a big, important, and like ambitious plan, and we really want to make sure that we can preserve as many of the ROIs, that sort of return on investment for students and the taxpayers. And so, even though some of the conversations are tough, it's really important for us to be a part of it because it really can pay dividends in the long run.
Well, and I think that's really important context to a lot of, why does MACo get involved in the education issues, or when we get to some of the environmental stuff, same thing, that ROI. We have a finite amount of money. I think no one knows us more than anyone who just kind of worked through this past session. And so are we really getting the best bang for our buck?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so all right, you unpack one for the listeners. What do you got? Where do you want to start? Let's go with energy.
Yeah, so 2025, this has been the year of energy, and so the presiding officers had three major bills, and the work that MACo did over the interim, just to kind of
Oh yeah.
unpack that. Yeah, so the three bills. Let's start with the biggest one as far as counties are concerned. Senate Bill 931, House Bill 1036, the Renewable Energy Certainty Act, and so this has kind of been the bill. You probably heard us talk about this on the podcast before, but then also the work leading up to it. And so this is the bill that really had to do everything with solar. And so MACo was involved for most of the interim in 2024, working with stakeholders in the industry and the administration and the environmental community, trying to build, what would legislation kind of look like to answer a lot of the big questions facing solar right now. And a big part of that is how do we balance the local authority shaping the look, smell, and feel of the places we call home with, we have to generate more energy. We have to do that in a way to fight climate change. And how do we balance kind of all of that going together? And so when Senate Bill 931, House Bill 1036 came in, we did initially vote to oppose the legislation because while there were some common themes of what we worked on over the interim, there was still a lot of, major missing components. I think we are very happy to report that as the bill finally passed the General Assembly and is headed currently to the governor's desk, we were able to secure quite a number of victories that answers, again, how do we balance that look, smell, and feel versus we have targets we have to hit. And so just kind of reviewing a couple of those livability standards in state law. So these are really good neighbor policies, setbacks, vegetation, watering plans, etc. And so for the first time, we have these enshrined in state law, enforceable at both the local and state level, just to make sure everyone has, again, common rules of the road, but good neighbor stuff. If a project's going to go next to a neighborhood, let's make sure it kind of blends in and adds to it and doesn't take away.
And that really lends itself to that look, smell, and feel thing, which really is so important for residents who live in these communities every day.
And I don't think, the average Joe walking down the street realizes when counties get a call, it's mostly on the look, smell, and feel stuff. It's mostly on, this glare is now in my window and, it's waking me up in the morning, or, this isn't vibing with the historic element of this community. That's the stuff people care about the most. So like something as in the weeds as a watering plan is actually really important for everyday communities.
Yeah. And if you don't live in those communities, you might not necessarily think about those things or be focused on them.
Exactly. Some other stuff that we were able to secure from for our folks, priority preservation areas. So PPAs are the most widely used agricultural preservation program in the state of Maryland. It's also one of the oldest programs in the state of Maryland. Not every jurisdiction has one. I believe there's about a handful, 4 or so that don't. But for those jurisdictions that have active priority preservation areas, by January 1st of this year, if you hit 5% of ground mount solar in those areas, you can now preserve those areas and say no to future development. That is a tool that we don't currently have. And for those folks kind of watching this conversation unfold, that's a tool that is not anywhere else in the United States. And so working with the House and Senate leadership, we were able to negotiate that. That's probably one of the biggest tools we have out of this bill to preserve agriculture in the state of Maryland. I definitely expect we'll have some tweaks in the future on that. That being said, I think this is a really big move forward on that balancing. How do we balance these multiple policy goals?
Yeah. And I think one thing that's always important to remind people is that just because there's a new tool doesn't mean that everyone's going to use it. It just gives you more discretion to have that tool be something you can use. It just speaks to the unique circumstances in a particular jurisdiction.
And, Sarah, that's a really good point. So on that of, just because we do something, it's still up to local discretion. We still need to have local decision making to kind of to go back to those livability standards. The really cool thing about those standards are they're not static. They're maximums. So a local jurisdiction for a setback, for example, whatever that setback is, a local jurisdiction can do less. And so in our areas that are probably more rural, that are going to be more targeted for solar development, they're probably going to want to have stricter standards because they know that they're going to get a large share of it. For those jurisdictions that don't think they're going to be targeted but do want to take more share of the solar, so for example, Howard County, I know that they're very active in trying to encourage more solar coming to their jurisdiction. They can set standards lower than what's in state law, so that this entire time we're preserving local flexibility, which is so important.
Yeah, exactly.
So finally, just one other thing in the energy bill that's a really big deal. We were able to get solar above 5 megawatts. And what does that mean? So a megawatt, think about 1 megawatt is about 3 to 5 acres or about 1.5 football fields. So 3 to 5 acres per megawatt. So these are pretty big facilities when we're at 5 or above. So facilities 5 or above, a county can now ban in their tier 1 and 2 growth areas. Now, what does that mean? We're getting very much in the weeds here. So tier 1 and 2 growth areas are the areas where we want to grow. And so tier 1 is where we currently have our development, we currently have our housing, maybe we have some of our municipalities in that area. Tier 2 is where we're now building the pipes towards. We're planning to build a new school or increase school capacity, et cetera. What we saw in a handful of cases, and there really weren't a lot, but they were meaningful, where we have pressure on the counties to do housing, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. And we also have pressure on the counties to do renewable energy. And there was a conflict because that same area, you can only do so much with one plot of land. And so we now answered, over here is where we want to focus development. Over here is where we want to focus energy production. And the two shall not meet, except if we're going to do it on rooftops, brownfields, et cetera, which we won't go down that rabbit hole. But for the first time with this bill, we have a lot of clarity for all the stakeholders, which is a really big win overall.
Definitely, especially when the goals are coming fast and they're ambitious, and you want to sort of keep everyone not necessarily going to be on the same page, but at least sometimes in the same chapter, if not in the same book.
Amen. And the one thing, I just have one more thing I want to say on this bill. I feel like I'm talking so much.
You never have one more thing to say. It's good.
Well, this is the bill that like I feel
17.
like I've been working on, yeah, for forever. So the fact that we actually passed it is huge. The process on this legislation, I feel like this was a quintessential Annapolis experience where, MACo, other stakeholders over the interim, we all came together. We said we're going to sharpen our pencils. We were going to do the hard work. We fought it out over legislative session, but we fought it out in a way where at the end of the day, everybody walked away with some victories, and we are moving multiple state goals forward. So just to all the stakeholders that worked with us, to the legislators, I really just want to give a shout out. MACo, we say it all the time. We are here to partner with the state. We're here to partner with other folks. And this is where the rubber meet the road, and we got there. And I'm very proud
Yeah.
of that.
Well, and I think you should definitely like big credit to you in terms of how you approach this, because making yourself like such an expert on this kind of information, I think really helps build trust in terms of like when you're having these negotiations, the people that the stakeholders that you're working with, they really understand that you really eat, sleep, live, and breathe this stuff. I mean, I think there was one time when you were in the back of a committee room and the chair or the vice chair was a question was asked, and I think you were sitting there like just so wanting to answer that question because you've got a lot of really good information to offer. And I think the chair said something like, Dom looks like he's about to jump out of his seat back there, so we might as well let him talk.
Amen. And if it wasn't for our subject matter experts, we would not be there. So
Totally.
shout out to them as well.
Yeah, that's the same in my portfolio.
For all of us, I mean, we are really working with some phenomenal people in local government. But to transition us, I just want to touch on the two other really big energy bills that popped up. So first, we had solar, and that took up kind of a lot of the oxygen. Next, Senate Bill 937, House Bill 1035, the Next Generation Energy Act. So for those folks not in county land, for those folks kind of in the environmental space and in the energy space, this is what everybody else was focusing on. So there was a key group of stakeholders on solar, and then everyone else in energy world was focused on the Next Generation Energy Act. And so kind of high level overview, what does this bill do? First, it takes nuclear energy as well as natural gas, and it basically sets a pipeline for how can we roll those energy sources out quicker. And so we've talked about this bill before on the pod, so you really shouldn't be surprised here that this was one of the biggest ones. But as everybody knows, Maryland right now, we are in a little bit of a issue with our energy. And so we're in the PJM region, which is a multi-state kind of cohort. We have Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania. We go all the way out to Illinois in some spots. And so in this entire region, we're seeing energy demand grow, and it's growing faster than production. A big part of that is because of data centers. And we did see plenty of bills on data centers, but we'll touch on those at another pod. But we are seeing energy demand grow. The Next Generation Energy Act is kind of meant to be that stopgap. What are we going to do over the short and medium term to expand new energy? And so a big part of that is going to be nuclear, especially the next generation small modular reactors. We are starting to see some development of that in the US and as well as Europe. But then also natural gas. Right now, we do have plentiful sources of natural gas. Important qualifier here is that the natural gas plants are set to be converted under this bill to some other type of renewable source, potentially hydrogen or something else, once that technology becomes kind of economically feasible and possible, et cetera. But this is looking to expand kind of, our generation over the short and medium term as we see the demand for electrification for data centers, et cetera, grow. This bill was also amended pretty significantly to include more elements on batteries and expanding the battery storage in the state of Maryland, especially if we're going to have renewable sources such as solar. We know we're going to have to see more batteries. Really important, a lot of the safety standards that we were talking about, fire suppression, et cetera, a lot of those started to make it into this legislation, which is really
That's what my
important.
question was going to be, because I know that's something that our members have been talking about for a number of years now, and just I'm not in that policy area, but I do know that that's been a major priority for residents.
100%. And I think if
Yeah.
anyone, thinks of MACo and batteries, the other word that comes to mind is fire suppression. Because
Hmm.
anytime we're talking about batteries, our members, our elected officials are solely focused on that issue. We were able to get some pretty big wins on battery safety in this bill, which I'm very proud of.
Awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know that was a long time coming.
Yeah. And so then moving on, the last bill, kind of the stepchild, if you will, Senate Bill 909, House Bill 1037, the Energy Resource Adequacy and Planning Act. And so this bill does exactly what it says. It sets the pathway for how are we going to grow our energy supply in Maryland. We do have the first two bills, which focuses on some specific means of doing that, but doing it in a more thoughtful, kind of well-directed way. And so definitely energy issues are not going anywhere. 2025 did live up to the hype. It was the session of energy. Yeah,
It really did.
it really was. And the ramp up in 24 was wild. But I will say this is not going to put the issue to bed. I would expect energy to kind of keep being a big issue, just like housing, in the next sessions to come. But Sarah, I did a lot of talking. I'm gonna give it over to you. What do you got next?
Well, that's a good inspiration to segue into a bill that I had, which also was energy focused. And so in the school and capital facilities portfolio that I took on this year, we had a bill. It was everyone refers to it as BEPS. This was House Bill 49. And so it got a lot of airtime, a lot of discussion, a lot of work and stakeholder collaboration. This was a Maryland Department of the Environment departmental bill. And this is a bill that has been coming for a while because it's sort of a passenger to the Climate Solutions Now Act that passed in, I think it was 2022. So the state, they have to establish and enforce these building energy performance standards for qualifying buildings. County buildings are required to comply, and that's with a few exemptions. I think there's K through 12 schools, ag buildings, historic buildings. There's a few things that were already carved out in the original language. And the number of buildings varies greatly statewide from county to county. I would say that 2/3 of our jurisdictions have 5 to 15 buildings, and a third have anywhere from 15 to 20. So all told, it's about, I'd say 200 to 250 buildings for our members, and some actually have none. But so this bill, it was attempting to establish the alternative compliance pathways that have a fee component. They, also have some waivers that you could get. Some other administrative reporting fees were in it. And our thing when we originally looked at this bill when it came in was, we wanted MDE to be able to share with us what are the costs across all those major things, the energy use intensity targets, the alternative compliance fee, and the administrative fee for reporting. So we were able to get one component there clarified, which is the admin fee to report your energy information for benchmarking. So this ended up being $100 per building. So most jurisdictions annually, that is going to be $500 to $1,500 for submitting those reports to MDE. And some of the larger jurisdictions, it gets into $2,000 and $3,000 a year. But all told, relatively low. But when it came to trying to get clarification on the other cost components, it does look like they're going to have to be dealt with in future years. But the other thing that we were really happy to see was this study provision. And there's language included in there that says that the state will have to study how these standards, whenever they get set, should be done most effectively, but also have to consider county buildings and how the standards should apply to them. Because there were exemptions for things like critical infrastructure and hospitals. And I think it was Senator Hester, actually, who very wisely pointed out that our county public safety, public health, and emergency service facilities are a major component of critical infrastructure that was already being considered in the bill. So if something goes wrong and you don't have all the critical infrastructure pieces still working or in trouble, whatever it is, then you'd be missing an important piece of the puzzle. So we think it would make sense for some of those buildings to be included under that definition. But so the study will give us some time to work through that piece of legislation before the real cost to counties would even kick in. So we landed in a pretty good place on this, but there's going to be more work to do in the future on it for sure.
Now, to take a step back, and you did a lot of work over this, and I know this is one of those bills, kind of just like the energy bills, where there's a ton of stakeholders who are interested. Like, very basic, break it down. What how would you follow a BEP? Like, would you have to put solar panels on or change your insulation? Like, what actually goes
Some of
in?
those things. Yeah. Well, so that's actually a piece of the bill that did pass. If we're going to get really into the nitty gritty, is that they did include a component that basically gives you credit for any renewable energy that you have currently operating on a site. So it's almost like a net metering component. But it's things like, backup generators and things that rely on fossil fuels and things like that. So it's trying to move away from those and into more renewable sources. And that's why they want the benchmarking information so they can see sort of where the buildings are now, what things functioning in those buildings are creating more energy, what tools are out there to try to find new supplements that can help still continue the type of energy generation that they need without creating some of the byproducts or some of those nasty byproducts for the environment. So yeah, so it's things like that, like what you're saying.
Awesome. Yeah, it definitely sounds like one of those kind of bang for your bucks. What's the ROI? How much are we investing kind of questions.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too that came up on this bill is that, the cost is an important component, particularly for counties, because, we don't have a lot of revenue authority. We do have a lot of mandates we're trying to fulfill, and we did get more revenue authority this year. But it's not just the cost. I mean, we have other jurisdictions that do have more of a focus when it comes to environmentally conscious initiatives. And there were some things in this bill that were trying to build a lot of sort of off ramps and waivers in for covered buildings and individuals who own covered buildings. And the interesting thing that came up about that for, some of the more environmentally conscious members and stakeholders is that without the benchmarks in place yet, we don't necessarily know if we need all those waivers and all those off ramps. And so they're good and they're useful for the people that need them. But without the benchmarks, it's sort of started to feel a little counterintuitive to put the cart before the horse and put the off ramps in place before the benchmarks were in place. So in that conversation went back and forth a lot. And I think that's actually what led to the study that's not just going to study, different types of buildings and what other exemptions could be considered, but also really what's the best way to do the program at the state level. So the conversation, it evolved a lot, and I think it got to a pretty good place.
Well, awesome. Good work.
Yeah. Well, so that segues us pretty well into environment. What do you have to tell us about some of your environment bills?
Yeah, so let's talk about one kind of big topic in particular. Took up a lot of oxygen this session, and I think it's going to take up a lot of oxygen moving forward, and that's PFAS. And so we had one bill in particular, House Bill 909, Senate Bill 732, which had to do with PFAS from sewage sludge and land application. So just to break that down, what are we actually talking about here? So PFAS, they're chemicals that are really water resistant, fire resistant. You find them in dental floss, but they're also found in crazy things like ketchup, your pots and pans that are non-stick. They used to be in firefighter foam in the state of Maryland, but my first session, we actually MACo worked on a bill to get that out of firefighter foam. But these chemicals are everywhere. They're in makeup. They're in all of these products. And so what happens is, you use them in dental floss, you rinse your mouth, you spit, and then that water goes into our wastewater treatment facilities. And so you can imagine that on all of the products. I mean, these are everywhere. We're starting to see potentially high levels of PFAS in our wastewater treatment facilities. Now, put a pin into that. We'll talk about testing in a second. But the idea is that they go to wastewater treatment. All the chemicals in sewage sludge are taken out. So, your wastewater goes in, the facility cleans it, and then clean water is pumped out. Well, you have two byproducts, actually. You have the clean water, and then you have the sludge. And so in Maryland, a lot of this sludge, and it's not only in Maryland, it's in other states, but a lot of the sludge is actually a really, really good fertilizer. It's high in nutrients and everything we need to kind of, grow crops. And so a number of jurisdictions, and Sarah, this gets pretty wild. So a number of jurisdictions actually use this sludge and sell it. And so it becomes a line item to offset the cost of operating this big piece of public infrastructure, which is absolutely wild, the circular nature of everything. And so what this bill would say is if you have a certain level of PFAS in your sewage sludge, you can't land apply for agriculture anymore. Now,
Okay.
yeah,
That makes sense.
yeah. So a couple of things that this kind of brings up, really big public policy questions. First, what who's responsible in that particular scenario? Is it the responsibility of the county who's operating the wastewater treatment facility? Is it the responsibility of, let's say you have a factory in your community and the factory uses PFAS and they're putting it in their wastewater? Is it the responsibility of the person who made the dental floss or the person who bought the dental floss? And so this bill has a ton of really unique and important and granular and critical to answer public policy questions. And so a number of which, we were working with stakeholders. We thought we were really close to a number of these answers. And while ultimately this bill didn't move forward, PFAS is going to come back over this interim and especially next year in a really big way. And
Yeah.
so,
Well, also, like, I think you maybe put a pin in it, but like, I think when it starts to come back too, like, maybe there's going to be more answers on the testing capacity. Because from what I understand, like, that's been a big question mark around this issue.
And 100%. And so thank you for coming back to that. The testing is a really big deal because, there's no federally mandated testing yet. We're starting to get close to having, regular state mandated testing. But some of the tests that we're getting back, a lot of our facilities, some of their numbers come back and they're pretty low and they're pretty reasonable. Some numbers come back and they're relatively high. And so there's a big question on, first of all, is there an adequate number of testing? Because a big issue that came up with the testing is you have advocates going out and saying, well, we did, these 14 PFAS tests and we got answers back within a week from a watershed. Well, if you talk to our folks who are actually operating the wastewater treatment facilities, the protocols for that testing are kind of dramatically different than what's in a, quote unquote, what a civilian can do. For a official wastewater treatment, or landfills have to get tested too. You can't touch certain materials. Again, I just keep coming back to dental floss because hopefully people are flossing their teeth every day. But like this stuff that we use every day, you can't touch that. You have to wear special gear when you're doing a proper test to make sure that there's nothing inadvertently kind of jacking your numbers up. So there's this question of, do we have the capacity, the actual, like, do we have enough labs in Maryland or close to Maryland to send these tests to get the answers in a certain amount of time? What are the protocols going to be, et cetera? The other question is, let's say we get high test numbers. How do we mitigate against that? And who's necessarily responsible? And what do you do in this scenario? And I feel like we're getting really in the weeds here, but again, these are critical questions that policymakers have to answer.
But there's also going to be sort of gauges too that have to basically do with like radon. Like there are certain numbers that are considered acceptable. Then you get into sort of the next range, which is like, this is a little bit more worrisome. And then you get into another range that is, all right, you should remediate. And it's sort of like, that's the other thing they probably need to figure out is sort of what those standards are going to be in terms of what's reasonable. But that needs a lot of research that comes with it.
Well, 100%, yeah, and not to put the cart before the horse. There's an entire question on what a reasonable number is, and
Yeah.
we can definitely get into that. But there's the question of, let's say that you hit a number and it's not reasonable, and you don't. It's not coming from a single or multiple industrial users. That's just the natural amount of PFAS from all the dental floss and all the ketchup and everything else that people are using. Well, what do you do in that scenario? Because the investment, we don't have the equipment yet to necessarily filter out and destroy this stuff. What infrastructure we could invest in is multi-million dollar, tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars equipment. So Howard County, Baltimore City, Anne Arundel, they're pretty well off jurisdictions, but they don't have the resources to invest in this. And so if we are going to start to take these steps, at what point do we need other partners to step in and kind of help us with this? Like, yes, there are issues, but just like we were talking about ROI, not even ROI, just basic, do we have the actual dollars to invest in this? The science is definitely moving faster than the policy at this point, and both of those are moving faster than the technology to mitigate. And this is going to be a big issue moving forward for.
It's going to be a long haul too. I think it's going to be like 5 to 7 years. I want to say.
I was just going to say 5, 10, probably even 15 years.
Yeah.
The only guarantee here is that this issue isn't going away.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Yeah. So on a happier note, you want to talk
on that
about
note. Yeah, that's a good segue. All right, so for public safety, there was a lot in this part of the portfolio. It's basically public safety and corrections, but the one that I wanted to talk to you about today was really this bill, that's Senate Bill 533, House Bill 238. It has to do with police accountability. It's a bipartisan effort. And so this bill specifically, it's regarding police accountability procedures for a civilian complaint of misconduct by an officer. So that's basically when someone has an incident happen and they go to their police accountability board. There's one in every jurisdiction, and they file this complaint. So this year, there were a lot of bills dealing with this sort of misconduct complaint review process. So but while there were a number of bills, this one really became the primary vehicle for updates here. And implementation has been ongoing for a while now. I want to say 5 years at this point. So it does seem to be the time that we really were able to look at some of the things so that we could tell these are the things that are really rising to the top that need to be taken a look at. And I think the main things stakeholders were circling around was there needed to be timeline adjustments for a case where criminal charges are potentially being filed against the officer for the incident that also gave rise to the civilian complaint. So, sort of to break this down simply, when this happens, it's best to make sure that the criminal charges get settled first, and then you move forward with the investigation for administrative charges after, so that you don't have the complications of a Fifth or a 14th Amendment violation. Because ultimately what can happen in that instance is it could lead to a mistrial. And this would not only compromise the opportunity for civilian reconciliation and police accountability, but also it could compromise the criminal case. So this is definitely better for accountability for sure. And this is something that when an independent review was done, that I think was actually commissioned by Governor's Office of Crime Prevention and Policy, every single jurisdiction brought this up as an issue. So that was part of the bill that passed, so Senate Bill 533. But the other thing that came up was this was that the Administrative Charging Committee that does the review of the police agency's investigation, they need enough time to not just do like a thorough review, but also request more investigation, more documents, subpoenas, and things like that, because that's the power that they've been given as part of this process. And so the current timeline, it just wasn't conducive to that in some narrow instances. So what the bill did was say that the law enforcement agency is going to get 11 months from the day of the complaint being filed to hand off that investigation to what is the Administrative Charging Committee. And then they will have 2 months for a review and filing of charges. So what originally was a year and a day timeline got shifted to a 13-month timeline. And it also clarified that the deadline for the law enforcement agency to hand off the investigation, that got clarified. So that was really good, and definitely necessary for making sure that this process had, the absolute utmost integrity, because we really need to be able to inspire confidence for the public in this process. And it was a really good collaboration, I think, between like us and the chiefs and sheriffs and, the ACLU, the Office of the Public Defender. There were a lot of people in this conversation and a lot of just good faith actors wanting to just work out some kinks that could erode the integrity of the process. So I was really happy to see that go through and be a part of those deliberations.
So, Sarah, I just have to say, I'm just sitting here taken back for a second. Your portfolio is wild, and the fact that you know all of this stuff, like just to kind of review over the past however long, half hour we've been on here, we covered education, building energy performance standards, and now we're on police accountability, and you know them all verbatim. Like
it's all over the place, yeah. But that's what keeps it fun and exciting, and especially it being, nonpartisan, nonprofit work. I mean, that's what I really enjoy about it. So.
And what other podcast offers you this breadth?
I know, right?
Cannot think
Checking
of
all the boxes. Well, on that note, yeah, so we go from public safety. Now let's roll on over to housing.
Yeah. So housing, definitely a really big issue this session. And just like energy, the state is really grappling with those big questions on, how do we balance kind of multiple priorities? How do we shape the look, smell, and feel of the communities we call home? And really, we're starting to dig into land use and zoning. And for decades, more than decades, that's really been in the purview of local jurisdictions. And we're starting nationally and definitely in Maryland, see the state, rethink some aspects of that authority. One kind of broad view that I've noticed is that when the state does start to look at, statewide universal zoning rules, it always gets tricky. And the two bills that we're going to talk about today on that, we're gonna see two examples. Zoning, it's inherently a local process, a local block by block, community by community, very long discussion, especially with the comprehensive plan process in counties. And Annapolis really doesn't have the infrastructure or the muscle memory to have a 2-hour hearing, in the state capitol to solve boots on the ground issues. And so
when you're weaving so many components together in this category too, that are so specifically local, that it's really oversimplifying. It really doesn't do it justice.
100%. And so let's dig into our first bill, and we'll kind of talk about some examples of that. But House Bill 503, Senate Bill 431. So this was the governor's housing bill. Initially, it was the Housing for Jobs Act, and then it turned into the Housing Production Act. And again, that theme of when the state tries to do something statewide on something that for decades has been local, it gets really tricky and in the weeds, and there's a lot of big questions and conversations. Broad aspects from both bills, but especially as amended when it was the Housing Production Act. We had housing targets for jurisdictions, a question on vesting, and then the broader impacts of housing. And so really quick, just to go over those three components, housing targets is exactly how it sounds. A jurisdiction would have been given a target to hit X. And so the theory is, we at the state level, we're not going to get super into the weeds. We're going to tell the jurisdictions to execute, and we're going to go and get out of the way. And this is something we've advocated before on solar. And really, it depends on how it's worded, but this could be a really good idea. And as it was worded in the amended bill, housing targets could have been a really good thing. Vesting, so very complicated, really short version of this. Vesting is just when do you hit pause on on when regulations would apply. And so Maryland, late vesting state. So you put your application in. Sometimes the state may change a few policies. And so we're able to kind of change some regulations. This says that the moment the application came in, we would hit the pause button. Again, simplifying a very kind of big, tricky, legally complicated question. And the vesting section was really what the House and especially the Senate were trying to chew over, and we're just having a difficult time because that really gets into the weeds. And then finally, the bill would have established a commission to look at the broader impacts of housing. And so for anyone who has, again, listened to this podcast, or for a number of years, MACo and MML have been asked to brief the Environment and Transportation Committee at the beginning of session on where we're at on housing. We talk about the broader impacts. And so it's not just local land use, but it's also labor, it's also materials, it's also, the financial markets and interest rates. And there's really a plethora, a universe of other things that impact the cost of housing. This would have set a commission to look at that. Now, ultimately, the House and the Senate couldn't agree, and the bill didn't end up moving forward. But there are going to be big conversations on all three of these topics and more on housing moving forward, and expect it to get really in the weeds and really tricky. Again, especially when you're talking about these block by block, community by community issues that we don't necessarily have the infrastructure to answer at the state level. So definitely
that's one of those things too, where you really have to spend a lot of time in the interim working through some of this stuff with the stakeholders, because on something this big that has so many different important pieces and so many stakeholders, it's just session by nature just really does not lend itself to dealing with those things once you get inside that time frame. So having that time in the interim, I think, is just worth its weight in gold.
Definitely. So moving on, we're going to talk about the other big housing bill, House Bill 1466, Senate Bill 891. So this has to do with ADUs or accessory dwelling units. And so this bill did pass, and it was one of the biggest housing bills of the session for sure. And so to talk about the process here, so last year, 2024, there was legislation to set up, or no, actually it wasn't 2024, it was 2023. Wow. I just had one of those moments where you realize you're old. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
how old you are, exactly.
Yeah. So in 2023, the General Assembly passed a commission to look at accessory dwelling units to make recommendations on kind of what that should be. And MACo was right in the center of that. And so House Bill 1466, Senate Bill 891. This bill is the kind of the process of that work product. And so MACo had 2 seats. Shout out to our friends from Queen Anne's County and Prince George's. Those are the 2 jurisdictions to take those seats for MACo. And so as introduced, the bill didn't really mesh with the core findings of what was in that final report. And so MACo came in support with amendments. And just like the Annapolis kind of legislative process, it did get a little messy. There was a little push back and forth there. But when push came to shove, we were able to kind of find a real consensus product that really reflected what was that report that came out. And so
Nice.
yeah. So what does this mean for local jurisdictions? Like practically what's in the legislation? So jurisdictions must allow accessory dwelling units in areas with a physical single family home. So it's not necessarily how the underlying area has been zoned, but it's what's physically kind of on the property. Now, this isn't to say it's a rubber stamp or an automatic yes. Counties do have to adopt formalized ADU policies, but the legislation is pretty respectful to local autonomy and to conditions on the ground. And so counties still retain a large amount of flexibility to really shape a lot of the factors. Again, I keep using these terms, look, smell, and feel, because that's what it really is. It's the place we're calling home and what makes that unique. And so counties have a lot of authority to still shape all of that, to shape kind of what ADU standards these must meet. Hagerstown had a really good example of this in the hearing. So when we were going back and forth on kind of what should be in the legislation, they have a unique setup where they have a lot of alleyways in the back of their houses. And so that might be the main access point. And so when you're talking about really technical things like setbacks and sewer connections and everything else, in your mind, you might think of a normal single family neighborhood, but with the unique geography of Hagerstown, it's not really set up like a neighborhood you would think that was built in the 1950s. And so this is just another example of when we really get into those zoning conversations, they get really tricky because communities are unique. That being said, this legislation gives a lot of deference and a lot of flexibility to local jurisdictions and communities. And so, we really do have a good
Nice.
work product to move housing forward while respecting the systems we have in Maryland.
Yeah, and that discretion piece is so important to our members for sure. Especially when like a lot of times the unique look, smell, and feel of a community is what makes people love it and want to take care of it.
100%. So, speaking of which, Sarah, would you like to close us out for the last bill of our Sine Die
Yeah.
wrap-up pod?
What is my last? Oh, right. Okay, so government liability in courts. This is another one from that portfolio. So this last one here for me, it's a very popular topic, particularly in judiciary proceedings and environment and transportation. And this is automated enforcement. There were a few different bills on speed cameras and school bus camera type stuff, because that's what I mean when I say automated enforcement. So for this one, I'm going to chat briefly about House Bill 182 that came from Delegate Von Steuer, who was really great to collaborate with on this. But sort of for some background, listeners might remember a high profile bill from last year that was establishing regulations and fine limits for speeding violations in a work zone. It was a lieutenant governor initiative, and it really came out of a response to an awful crash that happened in a construction zone or work zone on the Baltimore Beltway a couple of years ago. So the bill this year, House Bill 182, was looking to increase the fines for speeding in a school zone to be more consistent with the increases that were approved for work zones last year. So our members agree accountability and behavior change is important, particularly in areas where kids and families will be. So the new fine amounts are helpful. And truthfully, there are only like 9 jurisdictions out of 24 that have these cameras. But so our main request in looking at this bill was to change the language so it says the fine cannot exceed this new amount rather than is this new amount. And so that way, locally, we can exercise some discretion for mitigating circumstances for things like first-time drivers, first-time offenses, indigent circumstances, and things like that. And they were really willing to work with us on that language. So we were happy about that. And the other thing, they added a study to the bill, which is really just looking at how speed cameras and automated enforcement are going in school zones particularly, and really just looking at how many incidents we're having. What are the different policies and regs that are making them successful or not? We have some jurisdictions, especially with the bus driver shortages, that in some instances don't think that their walk shed is big enough. So looking at whether or not, maybe in some areas it needs to be expanded. So I think this will be really good to just sort of see how this process is going and see how it can really be refined to make sure that it's really lending itself to behavior change and to safety, particularly in areas where there are vulnerable individuals like work zones and like school zones and residential areas and things like that. So that was ultimately, I think, a really good one. And having that study, I think, will be really productive.
Awesome. These automated enforcement bills, they always get really tricky because, I mean, nobody likes a parking ticket or a speeding ticket. And every time you see one of these cameras, I'm sure we all have the same reaction. Oh my God. But then also, like, they're doing important things like protecting workers, protecting school kids. And so
Yeah.
definitely a tricky area.
Well, and that's the thing that I always like to point out is that, I think there's this perception that people are making a lot of money on these cameras. And for the most part, a lot of the money goes back into paying for the program to run the cameras. And then there's sort of a net that is not nearly as significant as people assume it is, but it also has to be reported to the state every year. So you can even look, and I've taken that document around to a number of people that are just really suspicious about certain cameras and placements and things like that, and really showing them that it's not as significant an amount of money as they are assuming in some instances. And in other instances, they're actually losing money on the program to make sure that these communities are safe. So yeah, so it's really just it's making sure that all the important components, I think, are in the conversation. Because yeah, I don't think anyone's thrilled about getting a citation in the mail from a speed camera. But at the end of the day, if it's saving lives and it changes behavior, then people will do it less, and that'll be better for residents overall.
Well, and one important kind of thought that just came to my mind while you were saying that, Sarah, and important context for public policy in Maryland, especially on speed cameras, but I mean, same thing for land use, same thing for four others. Each state in the U.S. is different. And so for Florida, for example, AAA used to do, and they might still do it, the worst cities in America to drive. And so they would have the list, and a lot of them would be, well, this place is obviously a speed trap, and they do a lot of automated enforcement. And this is how a local government might balance their books. They might actually do it in certain states based off of the number of speed cameras. But in the state of Maryland, local governments are highly regulated in where we can put them, what we can use the
Yeah.
fund for, how much they could be. I mean, same thing for school funding. I come from Pennsylvania. School districts are independent, and so they have their own taxing authority. Very different in the state of Maryland. Counties fund schools, but we don't really have any say after once the money leaves. And so just a different circumstance, very unique. And so kind of just keeping that context in mind always, just because we hear something bad out of Texas, California, Florida, or we might hear something good, Maryland, the county system is very unique, and we just always kind of should have that in the back of our minds.
Yeah, and I would say that goes across a number of different policy areas in terms of making sure that we're always trying to make a big effort to communicate that it is not necessarily apples to oranges or even like peaches, banana, like it can be all over the place. And so it's not one to one when you're looking at something that is somewhere else. It won't necessarily make sense here. Not that it doesn't have a concept or an idea that couldn't be applied in some way, but it needs to be thoughtful because yeah, you're right. Maryland's pretty unique.
So on a closing thought, Sarah, as we kind of, close the book on session 2025, what was, and it could be a serious policy bill, it could be one of the more silly ones. What was your favorite bill of this session?
My favorite bill of this session, I want to say it was probably that police accountability tolling provision bill, because it was just really nice to see the stakeholders coming together and having conversations that are important, listening to each other, making sure that everyone's concerns are heard, and also making sure that everyone comes out of it like not getting necessarily everything that you wanted, but really making some compromises so that everyone came away with something that feels like, we made progress together as a collaborative group. And I think that police accountability bill, I think was pretty important, especially because it encompasses like so many different elements of local government, like our attorneys and our police forces and the PAB and the ACCs and the trial boards. It all has to come together, and it all has to work together, and we have to work with other community stakeholders like OPD, and it was really nice to see that came together the way that it did and passed, and that everyone valued making sure that we were able to continue moving forward.
Nice.
What about you?
I have to say, I'm going in a little bit of a different direction with my answer. Mine is the state drink is an Orange Crush. Delaware be damned, they can shove it. They know in their heart of hearts the Orange Crush is in fact originally from Maryland, which is why we are an amazing state. And they're a bunch of losers. And so I'm happy that the General Assembly put that on the record.
Well, where a great place to have an Orange Crush would be?
The great state of Maryland.
Well, the summer conference.
Oh my God, yes. Are you talking about MACo's 2025 summer conference?
I might be.
Future?
Tell us all about it, Dom.
No, Sarah, I really should learn how to read a script, because that would have been a great transition.
I thought you were going to get it.
Anyway, yes. So we are going to have a summer conference, funding the future of the evolving role of local government. It will be August 13th through the 16th, 2025 at the Roland Powell Convention Center in sunny Ocean City, Maryland, Worcester County, Maryland. And I'm told is also a great place to enjoy an Orange Crush. Absolutely.
And wonderful content that, before long, we're going to be diving in on that being the next thing that overwhelms us. So
Yes.
Enjoy our little bit of a pause right now, because getting all that good content together, really, it takes a team, and it really comes together. And I think it really is a nice experience for everyone.
Amen.
All right. Well, so that is it for us. If you enjoy hearing about local politics and policy in Maryland, then be sure to subscribe to the Conduit Street podcast from whatever device and service platform you choose. You can also follow us on X, Facebook, and the Conduit Street blog. But for now, Dom Butchko, I'm Sarah Sample. Goodbye. Happy